One of the best known and yet least understood stories in all of Westfield history is the story about the little gray man. The little gray man is Lewis Allyn. Now, as I said, everybody knows that he was here and everybody knows something about him, but most of what people know is not factual. Now, there are some facts. Fact is, there was a Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. Allyn was a faculty member at the Normal School, today Westfield University, from 1902 to 1915. He was nationally known during the latter part of that era as the Little Gray Man. Westfield's health department did create the Westfield Standard of Food Purity in 1912. Allyn did become a central figure in a national pure food movement between 1912 and 1916. He was fired from the faculty of the Normal School in 1915. He was removed from the Westfield Board of Health in 1919, and he was murdered in May of 1940. Those are the facts of the case. However, Allyn was a product of a convergence of forces in the early 20th century. He was not a creator of them. First off, he played no role in the creation of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. He was not part of that. The forces that he was a product of were the emergence of a national consumer food product movement in the early 20th century. Before then, most of the breads and butters and milks and cereal and all the rest of the things you bought were usually local products. These national products needed a national marketing system and distribution. In order to become national, they somehow had to get to a national consumer. They needed a vehicle, and therefore they needed national advertising. And consequently, it led to the creation to national household magazines. Now, prior to that time, that's prior to about the 1890s, most magazines had very low circulation and were for an upper-class literate market. By the 1890s, the mass market magazines, some of which survived into pretty modern times, Collier's, Saturday Evening Post, Life, Look, Good Housekeeping, and on, those magazines were a product of this era. They could only exist if a new market existed, and that's what arose at this time. It was this large, new group of people called a middle class that had some excess money to spend. They could subscribe to these magazines. They could buy these national products. Now, late in the 19th century, there was a rise of science and health consciousness in the United States. There was a new interest in the findings of medicine. Late 19th century, we discovered bacteria and viruses and began to get some serious treatments for disease. It was also a time of food consciousness, the idea that health and food went together. This was the world of Graham, Dr. Graham, of Graham crackers, and the Kellogg brothers, of the Kellogg Health Institute and the Kellogg's Foods. Bernard McFadden and his health food movement. Germ theory. National consciousness of all these things arose with these national magazines. One of the results was the famous 1906 passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act, whose advocate was a Dr. Wiley from the federal government. Teddy Roosevelt and his progressive Republican Party are closely associated with this movement. Also, in 1906, the Good Housekeeping magazine was created. Now, today, I suppose most people are not familiar with that, but that was the first, and it became the biggest of the so-called women's magazines. The identification of the female of the household as consumer. Now, interesting enough, the Good Housekeeping magazine originated in Springfield, Massachusetts, and that's where it was published for the first few years of its life. In 1908, in response to this Pure Food and Drug Act, the Good Housekeeping magazine created a testing lab in Springfield, and they established the Good Housekeeping seal of approval. Now, again, I would assume that the younger listeners and watchers of this don't know what that is, but the older members will. Once upon a time, national products proudly advertised that they had the Good Housekeeping seal of approval. That meant, in theory, that you could be absolutely sure that this product was the best of its line, that it was healthy, that it was safe, that it was a good buy. It was only in the latter years of the Good Housekeeping seal that it was discovered that the seal meant nothing. It was given to products in exchange for advertising dollars. But anyway, in the early years of our story, Springfield was the center of this new movement. Now, Lewis B. Allyn was born in Montgomery, Mass. in 1874. He graduated from the Bristol, Connecticut High School, and in 1895 he returned to Westfield and entered the Westfield Normal School, today Westfield University. Now, this is a picture of the outing class of 1896, and Lewis Allyn is standing right here in the background. Now, a close-up view of this picture will show this darkly handsome young man in the background. And I want to emphasize that because it's going to become an important part of the story, the looks of Allyn. Now, Allyn was not a regularly enrolled student. At that point in time, the program was a 2-year program. And then there was an advanced 2 years of specialized courses that anyone could come and take. And Allyn was there for 2 years, and he took some of these advanced courses. Particularly, he took Chemistry 1 and Chemistry 2, the only chemistry courses that were then taught. When he left Westfield, he went to Harvard. Now, Harvard, he didn't go to Harvard University, but Harvard had become worried that it was losing its place of preparing high school teachers. So Harvard created a separate school called the Lawrence Science School that provided a 1-year program of training high school science teachers, and he enrolled in that. When he finished that 1 year, he taught high school in Warren, Mass. For a year, and then he went to the Perkins School for the Blind, where he taught for a 1.5 years, and there met the young woman who would be his wife. In 1902, he returned to Westfield. He was hired by the Westfield Normal School to teach math, physics, and this introductory chemistry course. But shortly after he got to the school, the chemistry course was changed. most of the advanced courses at the normal school were abolished by new state regulations. It was felt that students in the school who were primarily training for teaching in the lower grades didn't need the advanced courses in science and math and languages. So the science courses were consolidated, and the two chemistry courses were consolidated to a course called Practical or Kitchen Chemistry. Not quite sure what that means, but luckily we have some examples of that course and what was done in it here in the archives. Also in 1906, the city of Westfield created a Board of Health, and Allyn joined that Board of Health. Now, over the next few years, all kinds of legends abound about what Allyn did and didn't do, and how suddenly Westfield began to focus in on food. There are stories that there was an outbreak of sore mouths from eating lollipops in the children of Westfield. There are stories that there was a picnic by the girls at the normal school and everybody got sick. Most of these are stories. What we know is that by 1908, in Allyn's Practical Kitchen Chemistry, he was having the girls, and I want to emphasize here, at that point in time, there were no male students in the school at all. And the school had been reduced to a 2-year normal training program for the rural country schools. So the girls in the class began testing foods in town for bad things. They tested hundreds of them. They particularly tested patent medicines. Now, this was the day when patent medicines ruled. Patent medicines essentially were all some mixture of alcohol and opium. That's what they were. You took them, you felt better. So he began testing patent medicines, and the Board of Health began to list products that were found to be bad for you or that contain bad things. Now, Allyn particularly focused on coal tar dyes, food coloring, we know it today, and benzoate of soda, which was a preservative of foods. You could add it to foods that had passed their prime and then sell them because bad smells and bad taste disappeared. Now, it's important to note that the Pure Food and Drug Act said nothing about coal tar dyes or benzoate of soda. Allyn focused on them himself. He said these things were bad in foods, and the Westfield Board of Health listed things from the grocery stores that contained them as bad foods. 1910 and 1911, this food consciousness led to national food shows at Madison Square Garden. And Allyn and some of his students went to those pure food shows. And they set up a booth, the Westfield Normal School, where Allyn showed examples of these bad products as they were listed by the Westfield Board of Health. Bad because they contained coal tar dyes. And I want to emphasize that coal tar dyes sounds bad, but let me just say, food coloring. Some of you may remember a great scandal of a few years ago about red dye number 2, which suddenly hit American consciousness. By the way, they're still not illegal. At that food show in 1911, Allyn was approached by a reporter who worked for Collier's magazine. Now, I need to stop just a minute here and talk about the National Pure Food movement in 1910, 11, and 12. What had happened is the food industry, the bad sides of the food industry, and industrialists in general began to fight back. The era that brought about the 1906 Pure Food movement is called the muckraking movement. Now, it got that name in 1910 when Theodore Roosevelt began to feel that those who wanted reform had gone too far. Now, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 actually didn't do much to create pure foods and drug. The title sounds more impressive than the act. The act, by the way, had no teeth in it. You could break the law and you couldn't be punished by it. So it was one of those progressive acts that really didn't do what it said it was going to do. And the national magazines had created this national reform. We're going to clean up trusts. We're going to do trust busting in the era. We're going to get the robber barons. All of that was going on, and the robber barons fought back. And one of the ways they fought back was to cut off advertising to these national magazines that were leading the campaign. By now, Collier's magazine had reached 1 million circulation. But the difference between these new magazines and the ones of the 19th century, the ones of the 19th century were fairly expensive. They made their profits on the sale of the issues. The mass market magazines made their profits on advertising. The price of the issues, and most of these mass market magazines sold for 5 cents or 10 cents. They didn't even cover the postage and handling, let alone the production of the magazines. It was advertising that kept them alive. So the advertisers began to cut the economic feet out from underneath the muckraking magazines. The magazines had to find a new way of surviving. And there was Allyn and his list. The reporter from Collier's suggested that maybe they could simply change the approach. Instead of listing bad foods, why not list good foods? Instead of testing for bad products, test for good products. Out of that grew the Allyn Pure Food movement and the Westfield Standard. Collier's, and here is a January issue from 1913, with a lead story on the little gray man and a sexy, eye-catching portrait of the little gray man. And by the way, Allyn's portrait is at the center of all of this. There's an enormous emphasis upon this short, stocky man with the shock of pompadoured white hair. His hair turned white very young, but rather a handsome devil in the day when men are still having handlebar mustaches and beards. Every week thereafter, for a year and a half, Collier's pushed the Westfield Standard of Pure Foods. In fact, Collier's said, look, we'll pay to publish a book of the Pure Foods. And thus was born the little booklet, the Westfield Standard. Now, it's important to remember that Collier's is paying for the listing, publishing, and mailing of this little 10-cent pamphlet that was sold across the country in hundreds of thousands of copies. And in their advertising, full-page advertising, week after week, they pressed that all you had to do was send them 10 cents, and they would send you this list of good products. And the advertising, as you can see, showed the good products, and in every issue you could open the pages of the magazine and find full-page advertising for individual good products. Oh, they tried every kind of promotion. Club women could organize themselves and get clubs together to buy the magazine, the little booklet, and spread it around to all the people in their town. So everybody would buy these good products. They even jumped on the women's suffrage bandwagon. And Collier's created little stores called suffrage stores. Now, you want to keep in mind that this is an advertising gimmick. It's not the women of the suffragette movement who's doing this. It's Collier's magazine doing this, calling them suffragette stores. They even jumped on the union movement. They argued that only good, clean production facilities with union members. So union members ought to support the movement and buy products made by union people. They organized national campaigns throughout that year. Now, the individual behind much of this was a man by the name of Norman Hapcook. Norman Hapcook had come out of the Pure Foods movement. He was one of the great muckraking magazine editors of the day. He's associated with Harper's Magazine, Collier's Magazine. And in 1914, he goes to found a new collective of women's magazines. These included The Ladies' World, The Woman's World, The Housekeeper, a whole group of magazines aimed at the new consumer, the female head of household who's going to buy these products. And he switches from Collier's to the Women's World, and the movement becomes bigger. They organize national campaigns with grocers and give prizes for grocers who will decorate their store windows with the Pure Food products. And by the way, here in the archives we have many of the banners and advertising pieces from the storefronts. We also have numerous photographs of storefronts decorated for this campaign. They create the Westfield Domestic Science School. Now that sounds like it's something in Westfield. It isn't. It is a magazine touring campaign that went around the country. They organized conferences at which women were collected in large numbers to hear about these pure food products and the Westfield standard that guaranteed purity. At those national conventions of women, there would be displays by food companies. Now, I've included this one because this is the Crisco lard company display, and prominently displayed are photographs of Allyn, showing that Crisco is the product that is good for you. They even made a movie, The Poison in Food, and we have some advertising pieces from that movie with Allyn as the star of the great food reformer. Well, this was astounding. From 1913 through 1916, Westfield was at the center of this campaign, but it wasn't quite what it seemed. And I think Norman Hapcook, the man behind much of this, sums it up best with this quote. He said, "Thus a reform movement was made profitable to the manufacturers as it was beneficial to the consumer. and thus was a real solution made to the problems of how to improve our standards of business without causing embarrassment to business. Businesses who advertised in these magazines were included in the Pure Food list, and that the public was told that they were guaranteed pure because there was a laboratory in Westfield that tested all of these products to make sure that they were pure. Obviously, the little tiny chem lab at the normal school couldn't possibly be the pretense of this. So the McClure labs created a full laboratory in the Gillette block in Westfield. Now, this is the building on the corner of Elm and Arnold Street. It is today the home for the Westfield Gas and Electric Company. Allyn had the top floor, and that was the McClure testing lab. There, we're told in the advertising, Allyn tested 1,000 products a year and was able to ascertain which ones were good and pure and which ones weren't. Now, the problem was that Allyn has no degree. Allyn has only taken 2 introductory courses in chemistry, and Allyn's staff is made up of high school girls from the normal school. Now, I have no idea today how much real science was done there, but I'm absolutely certain that there is no way that good chemical analysis of 1,000 products a year were ever done in the Westfield McClure testing labs. Well, all this publicity brought antagonism. There were many people, including businessmen and industrialists, who did not like that. And questions were raised in the Massachusetts legislature about what was Allyn doing as an employee of the state. The Commissioner of Education said he would investigate, and Allyn was allowed to resign in January of 1915. It probably didn't bother him very much because he was riding high in this national campaign. But now he could no longer use the girls from the testing lab. So he was able to hire one young man who had recently graduated from Amherst College. And he and this young man, at least for a couple of years, served in the testing lab. The young man left after a couple of years, and Allyn replaced the normal school girls with Westfield high school girls. Again, as a subnote, I should mention, throughout this, it's always young girls that are his staff. Things got more intense. Allyn was sued by one businessman in Springfield and was fined $1,000 for listing a product that he made a mistake in the analysis of. The city of Westfield covered the fine, but the city fathers were not happy. The American Chemical Association investigated Allyn in 1916. They didn't throw him out, but they censured him because they said he was commercializing his chemical skills. In other words, he was selling products based on his chemical analysis. Then World War I came, 1916, and suddenly the pure food movement goes out the windows. It's now produce everything everywhere and don't question anything of the government or any businessman or anybody who's helping the war effort. The pure food movement stopped. Allyn stopped. When the war was over with, the first election of 1919, Allyn was removed from the Board of Health. The complaints against him were the lawsuits in the city, the supposed bad reputation the city was getting. He was particularly attacked by dairy farmers of New England. And the reason they were complaining is because he had said oleomargarine, margarine, was a good product. Now, you've got to be beyond a certain age to remember. I'm old enough to remember that and I'm from New York State. In New York State, oleo, as it was then called, or margarine, was sold as a white brick. It looked like a brick of lard, and you got a little plastic package of dye, yellow dye, and you mixed the dye into this white brick in order to get a thing that looked like butter. It was illegal, at least in New York State, to sell undyed margarine, to sell margarine that wasn't pure white and distasteful looking. So the dairy industry got him. The biggest threat against Allyn was the city wanted to know, where did all the money go? Now, literally hundreds of thousands of these little booklets, the Pure Foods booklet, were sold claiming that it was a product of the Westfield Board of Health. They were sold for 10 cents apiece, which doesn't sound like very much, but multiply them by hundreds of thousands and think in terms of incomes in 1915, 16, 17. It was a substantial amount of money, particularly since Allyn was a paid employee of the city on the Board of Health. Truth is that the little booklet hadn't been produced in Westfield at all. Westfield had not paid for its production or its mailing or its advertising or anything. But if he claimed that, then what happened to the Westfield Standard and the Westfield Pure Foods movement? So Allyn was gone. He disappeared from the public consciousness. Allyn was dismissed. Now, he continued to work in his labs. Here's a kind of collage of photos of Allyn intently peering into his microscope, and also he was a very athletic man. He loved high school sports. He was noted for telling all high school sports. He founded an archery club. He was rather noted for his archery skills. He also belonged to shooting clubs, tennis, very active, getting stockier as the age passed, but healthy, effective man in the community. But it was very unclear what was going on throughout all those years. The Pure Foods lab continued. In fact, 1939 was the last edition of the Pure Foods booklet, but very little else. And then at 10:30 at night, on the 7th of May, 1940, while Allyn was sitting in his living room reading a detective story called The Gun, someone shot him 4 times. Now, about 25 years ago, Mike McCartney, who was a professor in the Criminal Justice Department of the Westfield University, did an investigation of the Allyn murder and wrote it up in Yankee Magazine. And then about 10 years ago, Mike McCabe, a member of the Westfield Police Department, began to investigate the Allyn murder. He successfully found the crime scene photos and the other missing documents from the investigation. The end result is the murder is still unsolved. Now, there were lots of rumors. By the way, the murder got national coverage. Allyn suddenly was revived as a national figure. There were rumors that the mafia had shot him because he was working for the FBI investigating mafia schemes in drugs. That he was murdered by Nazis. This was a Nazi plot to subvert secret formulas. There were mysterious men lurking outside the house who mysteriously got on the train to Boston. None of these rumors had any facts behind them. There were also rumors that grocers finally got him. There was no evidence. It had been 20 years since Allyn had been involved in any grocer-involved anything. There was some information, however, that might prove evidence of other causes, but nobody seemed to pay any attention to it. One, Allyn was broke. At his death, his estate totaled $3,000, a $500 car, $1,500 worth of lab equipment, and minor other things. There's no mention of the house on Western Avenue. He had $38 in the bank. The day before, he had taken the last $191 that he had excess in the bank in a check and had driven it to Springfield to pay the overdue premium on his life insurance policy. And by the way, he had borrowed heavily against that life insurance policy. He had a safety deposit box, and when it was opened, there were various things found in it. One of the things that was found were defunct stock certificates in 25 different companies that had failed, that he had been promoting at various times in his life, and in which he had involved a number of his friends and acquaintances. The other thing that was out there, and I should divert just a little minute and tell you that I began working with the story of Allyn early in the 1970s, almost 50 years ago. At that time, there were numerous people alive in town who had known Allyn, and because I was at the Westfield University at that time, in alumni meetings, I dealt with a number of elderly women who had been his student, including a few who had worked in his lab. There was always a hint among those students and among the people in town who knew him that Allyn had an eye for the ladies. He was always considered a handsome ladies' man. And it was always emphasized that the ladies were young. Allyn had a reputation of something other than this respectable, prosperous businessman in town. And yet his murder is unsolved. We're now 60 years beyond it, and there's still a great interest. He is remembered for being murdered in an unsolved crime. He is also remembered not for what he did, but for what he didn't do. Here again, we have an example of the legend replacing the fact.